I was on a dangerous weekend when I decided to go visit my mother-in-law and father-in-law. This is while they're still alive, of course. And my wife and I made the venture to see them back at my wife's old hometown. And I had actually been in that hometown as a summer youth intern at this church. And I met my wife, Debbie. She was part of the youth group. I was the youth minister for the summer. We didn't even have a scandal, but we fell in love, and the rest is history. We got married 2 years later, and we've been married 50 and a half years as I make this video today. And I met some great people. And there's this one gentleman that I met who was in his 70s when I met him. And I'll call him Bill, for lack of a better name. I'll just call him Bill. And he was one of these old guys that had, he knew about life. You've known people like that. And so anyway, I got to love him and know him a little bit. And then 10 years later, I make this epic trip back to see our in-laws. We had been many times, but I hadn't seen Bill in years. And while I was there, I went to church where Debbie and I had met, and I heard from his wife that Bill was dying of cancer. He only had a few weeks to live. And she asked me if I could go see him before I left town. And so the next day was Monday, and I told Debbie I have to go see Bill. So I drove out and I found their house. They lived out in the country. They lived in like a 3-bedroom, kind of wood frame, very modest house. Nothing to write home about, very homey. And I went to see a dying man. And when I walked in, his wife told me, "Well, he's asleep." And I said, "Well, just don't wake him." And she said, "No, I told him you were coming. He wants to see you." And I said, "Okay." So she woke him up, and I go in there, and she leaves us alone. The next hour of my life with Bill is one of the top hours of my whole life. I mean, there's birth of children, there's weddings of children, there's birth of grandchildren. Those are all important. A few anniversaries with the wife, all those things are important. The hour I spent with Bill on this particular Monday afternoon has to rank up there with life-changing moments for this guy's life. And you've had them too. He was grieving because he was dying. His wife was grieving, even though he hadn't died yet, but she was already in the midst of grief with her soon to be dying husband. He was dying. And I want to tell you about Bill. And what do you think we talked about in that hour? Well, I'll tell you what we did not talk about. We talked about, oh, by the way, he was in a chair. He had a blanket up to his neck because he was cold. He didn't have his false teeth in, and he didn't have his glasses on. He could hardly see, and he finally got his glasses on, and he looked like a dying man. I don't like those days when I go see dying people, and you've been there. I know you've been there. Maybe we've all been there. I don't know your experience, but I know mine. It ranks way up there. And so here's what we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about all the bad breaks he had received. We didn't talk about the people who had harmed him. We didn't talk about bad bosses. We didn't talk about how he got got screwed in life with other people, how people had treated him badly. He didn't talk about politics, for crying out loud. He didn't talk about politics. He didn't talk about his sports teams that won or lost, and all the aggravation they caused, all that stuff. You know what he talked about? He talked about people. He talked about the people in his life that was the most important. He started out by talking about his wife. His wife had been sick, he told me, for about 3 months. And then he got the diagnosis of cancer, and his wife had been real sick, not a terminal disease like he had, but she was not doing well at all. So he talked about her, and he said, "David, it's amazing when I got this, and when I started to get sick and the doctor gave me the news, she suddenly got better. And she's done nothing but serve me and take care of me. As I go downhill, she gets stronger." And right there in the midst of death, I saw life, and I saw a key to a great relationship, a great marriage. I'm sure they had their arguments. I'm sure they had their problems. I'm sure they probably had really tough times. But I tell you what they always had. They had love. And love is not always fireworks, is it? It's not always all the great things. Sometimes it's taking care of your dying spouse. I saw what love was all about. Then he talked about his two boys. I knew one of his boys, but I didn't know both of them. He talked about both his boys. You know what he didn't talk about his sons? And they were both in their 50s at this time. He didn't talk about how they left his tools outside and messed up a good hammer or saw or whatever. He didn't talk about their messy rooms. He didn't talk about the bad times with the kids and how they didn't respect him. No, he talked with pride about his two boys. He talked about when his two boys built a barn together. They were like 8, 9, 10, 11, something like that. And one summer he said, boys, we need to build a barn. So they built this barn together. Can you imagine an 8-year-old or 10-year-old? Maybe they were a little older. Can you imagine the help they might have been to him? They might have been more of an aggravation than anything else. But when he talked to me about them, it was if they built the Astrodome, and I'm from Houston, so I'll use that illustration. Like they built the Astrodome together, or the Empire State Building, or some other grand building. He was so full of pride, good pride, not arrogant pride, but so proud of his two boys and the men they have become and the husbands they were. He told me about how they loved their wives and how they loved their children. And all he talked about was the positive stuff, not the negative. Because you see, death sometimes opens our eyes to reality and to what's really good and important. You ever been there? And then he talked about his grandchildren. It was then I realized I was going to be there for quite a while, and I was for about 45 minutes talking about his grandchildren. He named each of them. I knew a couple of them, but I didn't know all of them. By the time I left that day, I think I knew each one of them. And he listed them in the order of their birth. He told me their first name and their middle name. And I get choked up telling you about this because we have 10 grandchildren and I'm getting really old. In fact, I'm older now than he was when he died. And he talked about his grandkids with pride and how he loved them and their achievements and all the stuff that's good and wholesome about life. Here's this dying man teaching this guy about life. Pretty spectacular. I was about ready to go because I'd been there over an hour, and I said, well, Bill, I'm going to have to go. And he said, before you go, I want to show you a picture. And he called his wife, and he wanted a picture of his only great-grandchild. He had one great-grandchild. I don't have any great-grandchildren. I have 10 great-grandchildren, but they're not great-grandchildren. They're great-grandchildren. You get it? They're our grandchildren, but they're great. Well, he was telling me about his great-grandchild. I think his name was Dusty. He got a picture of Dusty, and I had to go over there because he's holding this picture, and I had to go around. And I went over there, and I looked over his shoulder, and he said, David, this is as grand as it gets right here. I said, Bill, he looks just like you. He said, oh, he doesn't look like me. I'm an old, washed up old man. I said, no, because I see the spark of life all in him. I see the spark. Earlier, when I got there, he said, David, do you remember that time in the park at church where we had this cookout in the park across the street from the church building after Vacation Bible School? And my wife and I brought food up there, and you and Debbie, you guys were sparking. And I said, sparking? What does that mean? I didn't know what sparking meant. I do now. And the truth is, Debbie and I were sparking. And that was what old timers used to call courting, when you fall madly in love with somebody and you start dating and you spark. And when he described what sparking was, I said, you're right. I do remember Debbie and me sparking. And he said, David, I was sitting all alone on this picnic table and all these people are around and I could hardly walk. And you came up and you came up and you and Debbie sat down and talked with me. Do you remember that day? Honestly, I didn't remember it at all. He remembered it. And I kind of lied to him. I'm not proud of lying, but I really spoke the truth, but I wasn't totally honest with him. And by the way, I'm not guilty about that, but don't go out and lie and quote me as a source. That's okay. He said, do you remember that day? And I said, Bill, I don't think I will ever forget that day. And I haven't, because he reminded me of it. So when he held up that picture of his great-grandson, I saw the spirit of my friend Bill all in that kid. That kid was sparking life in this old man that was dying. I hugged him. I wept. I thanked him for the great hour that we had spent together. For in that hour, an old dying man taught me about life. I had a conversation with death, and life showed up. I don't know what you're dealing with as you watch this video about grief. I don't know where your grief is, how deep it is, but I know you're hurting. I know you know somebody that's hurting. I'll tell you what, the secret to dealing with horrific loss is not deny the loss. Be honest with it. Bill did not like that he was dying with cancer. His wife didn't like it. His kids didn't like it. His grandkids didn't like it. And I'm sure Dusty didn't like it. But he was dealing with death. And though he didn't like it, and though he had wrestled against it and fought against it, and though if he had his way, he wouldn't have that cancer, he said, this blankety blank cancer that's taken my life. No, he fought it. But how he handled it is he started to focus on the blessings he had and not on the stuff he was losing, like life. He's a perfect example of how to deal with grief. Admit it, give yourself permission to grieve, and then start thinking about what you still have, the blessings you have, the memories you have, and then get up with your grief and pain and live forward with life words, not death words. Thank you, Bill. I can't wait to go to heaven and look him up. I don't know what's heaven going to be, but I know we'll have relationships because God is all about love, not death. He's all about life. He's all about love. And I thank God for Bill, who taught this guy what it means to live. When I got back home, by the way, I hugged my kids a little longer. I hugged my wife a lot more. I spent more time at home. I had a conversation with death, and life showed up. May God bless you as you struggle with whatever you're going through. At Spark of Life, we believe in hope. We believe in sparking in the midst of pain. At Spark of Life, there's always, always hope.